For Freytag's Pyramid, we have chosen the short story entitled The Cathedral, written by Raymond Carver. The characters in the story are the narrator's wife, Robert, Biola, and the officer. The narrator, an unnamed man who describes his experience with Robert. The narrator is jealous of the man from his wife's past and doesn't want Robert to visit, but he eventually connects with him when they draw a cathedral together. While his eyes are closed, the narrator has an epiphany after finishing the drawing in which he feels like he isn't anywhere. The narrator has a reputation for being a bad lad. As a result, the term anti-hero is commonly used to describe him. The nameless narrator of Cathedral smokes marijuana and drinks a lot of scotch. When he is envious, he makes jokes about blind people and is maybe downright cruel. Next is the narrator's wife, a nameless woman who invites Robert to their home. The wife has kept in touch with Robert since they met 10 years ago, exchanging audio tapes with him and telling him everything about her life. Before she married the narrator, she'd been married to a military officer and was so unhappy that she tried to kill herself. The narrator's wife appears to have key character attributes such as kindness, sincerity, and openness. Because she sleeps through much of the story's current action, the narrator's background information is crucial to comprehending her. She'd be a bare drawing if we didn't have it. This background information has an impact on how we perceived her behavior through the novel. Her story's trajectory appears to be comparable to the narrator's story. She has identical preconceptions about her husband as he does about Robert. She doesn't realize he's jealous, and she expects he'll be cruel to Robert as a result. We can also observe that she is neglecting her husband's comfort in her efforts to make Robert feel at ease. She doesn't seem to realize that meeting Robert may be uncomfortable for him, if not agonizing for him. Next is Robert, the blind man. Robert visits the narrator and his wife after his own wife, Biola, dies. He is a caring, easygoing man who sets even the narrator at ease. He encourages the narrator to draw a cathedral when the narrator is unable to describe one in words. Robert appears to be a lovely man who would be a pleasure to get to know. This isn't always obvious until the story has been thoroughly unfolded. Robert is initially a strange figure to the narrator, and hence to the reader. Because the narrator doesn't trust him, some readers could assume he's a good man. Others may identify with the narrator's point of view, which goes something like this. Robert has been lurking in the background of his wife's life throughout their marriage. It's no surprise that the narrator views Robert as potentially unscrupulous character. After all, while Robert worked for him, he caressed his wife's face. After that, Robert married the next woman he hired, all the while corresponding regularly with the narrator's wife. For all the narrator knows, Robert could be plotting to seduce the narrator's wife. The image of this rakish blind man is diametrically opposed to any notions we may have about recent widowers. However, the narrator remains concerned. Robert's anxieties should be dispelled by the narrator's remark that he had stooped shoulders as if he carried a huge weight there. It's difficult to avoid the impression that Robert is overburdened, though the narrator appears nearly indifferent. We feel his pain. Next is Viola. Viola is Robert's late wife. Her family lives in Connecticut and she died of cancer recently. She met Robert in the same way as the narrator's wife did, by responding to a job posting and taking a position with him. We don't know much else about her, but she plays a crucial role in the plot. In one way, her recent death allows the readers to sympathize with Robert, especially when the narrator begins to use her as a springboard for some sort of his worst jokes, assumptions, and ideas. Next is the officer. The officer was the narrator's wife's childhood sweetheart and her first husband. The narrator is envious of him and perhaps even enraged by him. The officer, like Viola, assists in the exposure of other characters. He reveals the narrator's envy, his fascination with his wife's background, and the possibility that he holds the officer responsible for his wife's prior misfortune. The officer also provides insight into the narrator's wife, portraying her as a sensitive and disturbed individual. He's a foil for the storyteller, just like Viola. The narrator's existence is supposed to be in stark contrast to his wife's with the officer. However, unless something changes soon, the narrator risks being ex husband number two. Next is the setting. The setting of the short story entitled Cathedral is at one night in a New York home, late 1970s or early 1980s. Cathedral is first published in 1981. It is set during the early phases of the transition from black and white to color television and when cassette tapes were a cutting edge technology. The story takes place during evening in a middle class residence somewhere in New York. In a piece entitled Cathedral, one may expect a little more complexity in the setting. It is, but only by a small margin. An average living room is changed into what could be termed a scary place, similar to a cathedral, but one where the people in it are worshipping only one another after a few drinks, a large lunch, and some marijuana. Something spectacular happens as Robert and the narrator draw the cathedral together in front of the narrator's sleeping wife. Something that isn't always obvious to the naked sight. When the woman awakens, she is unable to comprehend what she sees. The narrator shuts his eyes shortly after she opens hers, but continues to draw, with Robert's fingers tightly around his. It was like nothing else in my life up to now, the narrator exclaims to the supposed reader. Perhaps the encounter is so extraordinary because the narrator can interact with Robert not only without words but in ways he had never imagined. He's taken aback not only by the process but also by his closeness to Robert. The literal setting of the story, his home, is not a problem for the narrator. He's instead enslaved by routine, repetition, and his narrow vision. For however long the sighted moment lasts, it is a description of his liberation from those parts of his life surroundings. He doesn't just feel like he's not in his house, but he also doesn't feel like he's in himself.